Welcome everybody to the Knowledge Translation and Exchange Community of Practice for this afternoon. I'm Melanie Barwick. It's my pleasure to host you here at SickKids in our wonderful new auditorium. It's also my great pleasure to host Dr. Tamika Hayden, who is a close friend, collaborator, and lucky to have her here all the way from Melbourne, Australia, to talk to you this afternoon and to also run a social media workshop with me on Thursday, for which there's still room. So we can hook you into that. So Tamika is from Melbourne, Australia. She is the principal of Knowledge Translation Australia. She's also a partner with us in running Scientist Knowledge Translation Training Australia in partnership with the Learning Institute here at SickKids. Tamika has a PhD in bioinformatics, biomechanics, and very different, and was the first Australian graduate of our Knowledge Translation Professional Certificate back in the fall of 2012. She is also an adjunct scientist with the University of Western Australia, and we try and partner on lots of fun things together. So it's really my pleasure to have Tamika join us today and talk to you about some of the challenges and opportunities that she is aware of and what she's experiencing in knowledge translation in Australia and in her part of the world, and then how that relates to knowledge translation globally. So without further ado, I'm going to leave it to you. Turn this mic off. You can flip over to that one. One of the things I will mention, actually, just in view of how technologically challenged I am, but you all have microphones in front of you. As you can see, many of you have microphones in front of you. When it's time for question and answers, for those of you, question period, for those of you in the room, you would just press the little dot in front of your microphone, don't do it now, and it will cue you. If it's solid, you are on to ask a question and everyone in the room will hear your question. If it's blinking, you're in queue. The minute it stops blinking, you're on. Okay? If you've asked your question and you're finished, you can just depress this so that it goes dark again, and then the next person will get an opportunity to ask a question. I'll be moderating and monitoring the online webinar piece and the questions that are coming through the computer from about 30 people who are joining by webinar, and so we'll handle that. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes or so and then have time for questions. Perfect. Okay, thanks a lot.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you for having me. And I'm not jet lagged, I must admit, because I have been traveling around. So I've been on the time zone for a little while. And thank you for the introduction, Melanie. And yes, we've done tons of things together and it's exciting and we keep doing fun things together. So love the opportunity to speak to you. Obviously, you know, I'm going to talk about international perspectives, mostly from Australia, and I'm sure that some of you have other perspectives on things happening in other places in the world as well. So when we have questions or during, you know, I'm not television, so if you really need to add something or ask a question, please do. I like interaction a little more. So Melanie actually asked me where this picture was from, and it is in Melbourne. It's from a place called Prince's Wharf. But first I want to talk a little bit about me and give you a little bit of background about where I'm from. So Melbourne, anyone here been to Melbourne? Yes, yes, two. Anyone else been to Australia at all? But not to Melbourne, okay. So Melbourne is a fun place. Been there for 2 years this week, scarily, previously Perth, and Melbourne is renowned for its cafes, its cafe culture, its laneways. The people who have been there are nodding because we have the best coffee in the world. Well, you know, you can argue with me about that. We also have a lot of graffiti, which is fun, and we have the little boat sheds on the boat, which are at the beach, which kind of like Vancouver, it's too cold to swim at, but you know, we have a beach. So I have a pretty wide and varied background. I have a PhD in biomechanics, as Melanie talked about, but I've done a whole raft of things in biomechanics and a lot of research, different research areas, which gives me a nice broad background, and I've worked directly with clinicians for a lot of what I've done as well. And I was really fortunate with the forensic biomechanics stuff to be working directly with with a funder who was looking at workplace safety. So it was really interesting to be able to work with someone directly who was creating policy. And then finally sort of moving through all the way to doing epidemiology. I moved into kind of managing other people's research as I realised that doing research and writing research grants wasn't really for me. It was a long and arduous journey. So, and then I came to Canada and did KTPC 4.5 years ago now, and loved KT. I mean, before I came here, I was managing a Centre of Research Excellence. We talked a lot about translation, but we didn't really do translation, so I was really excited.
Sorry.
Is it going to work? Can you hear me now? Oh, awesome. It's good times. Love the laughter. So I was working for a Centre of Research Excellence, and I really loved that management of research, but I also got to work with policymakers directly and create opportunities, do a bit of brokering with people who we needed to work with to make sure that our work did more. And I'd never really heard much about translation. I'd been a researcher, but I hadn't really thought about I didn't know how to get the work out, but I'd always thought, who's going to use my work and how am I, this little researcher, going to have this change and create policy change or do great things? And I'd always just assumed my supervisors would do that or someone else in the university would take care of that. It happened. But I did wonder, how am I going to create change? So learning about knowledge translation in Canada and finding that online and going, yeah, I get to come and learn all about this was really exciting. It was a real penny drop moment for me that what I'd been looking for all this time really did exist. It didn't exist in Australia, but it existed here, and so I was very excited to come. I got to take my knowledge back and work directly with the institute that I worked at the time, a children's research institute, to talk about strategy and how we would do KT as an institute, which was really exciting. We were going through a lot of change, new strategic planning, and working really closely with people on that. So that was something great that came out of being able to do translation. But then I kind of outgrew my job. I realised there was more change I could have. I wanted to do bigger and better things, as we all do. As researchers, we're constantly saying, I want to change the world. Does anyone not think that? We don't know how we're going to do it, but we want to, right? We want to create new things, excitement. We always want to learn. And being one of those people who wants to keep learning, I had to keep doing something different. So for me, that came in the form of Knowledge Translation Australia. It came in the form of saying, how can I help more people do this? How can I create bigger change than I can just being a researcher? So for me, late 2013, I thought, okay, is this going to happen? Can I do this? I'm kind of outgrowing my job. I want to help more people. A few people had said to me, oh, I need your help. Can you help me? And it took sort of till March 2014, I took this leap of I'm going to consult in knowledge translation. And it's been going now for about 3 years in April, next week. And it's just getting stronger. And you're going to see as we go through my presentation today, why it's just taking off now. I've been sitting in the wings, if you like, waiting for things to happen. And it's been a lot of pedaling along, waiting. And now all of a sudden things are changing. And they're not just changing in Australia, they're changing quite globally as well, which is very exciting. It's exciting for me. It's an exciting opportunity for consulting in this space. So in Australia, what's happening? Well, we have a lot of challenges. I mean, firstly, please come in, sit down, it's fine. It's very casual, it's all good. We have a lot of challenges around KT because the terminology. So in Australia, we talk about research translation and we talk about translational research, and we use the terms interchangeably. Even our funders use the terms interchangeably. No one really knows what it is. There are a few people, of course. It's getting more and more. But for the most part, when you talk to a group of researchers and you say, have you heard of knowledge translation? They'll say no. So have you heard of research translation? They'll say, yeah, maybe. And you say, what is research translation? They'll say, that means I need to publish my papers at the end of my research. Generally, I'm generalizing. Of course, there are people who know more than that. So we have, like everyone else, the terminology issues, but our funders are deciding to keep talking about research translation. My personal reason for not liking that is that it sort of suggests that research is the only knowledge, and we know that there's more knowledge than just research. Awareness of translation and what it is, or that it exists, and training of researchers to do this. We don't, as a PhD, you're never sort of given the skills to work more with your partners, to think about what the end game might look like, or even given the opportunity for funding to do more with your work. So that's a real downfall of our system at the moment. And it's just not seen as being important. There's a lot of debate over, is this my role? I'm a researcher. Should I be doing KT? I'm not funded to do that. It's not important to me. So then on to funding, and it's starting to get more prevalent that people will fund KT. That's just happened last year, very late last year. A couple of funders came on board. I'll talk more about that as we go through. But for the most part, it's not funded, it's not recognised, and it's definitely not rewarded. So when you apply for funding, the key things are peer review citations, peer review journal articles, sorry, high citation level, the H-index, and category 1 funding, so from major funders. There is no reward for working with partners, there's no reward for translation in either the university system or in the funding system. So at the moment, there's no kind of carrot and stick situation for us. But change is coming, it's exciting. So what's happened over time? So NHMRC is the National Health and Medical Research Council, for those of you who don't know what it is. It's the same as CIHR. So it's our major medical funder in Australia. And what was really interesting in preparing this talk, I decided to go back, and I've done this a couple of times just out of curiosity for myself anyway, to see how often they use the term translation or translational, because as I said, they use these interchangeably. And over the years, we can see not at all in their plan. So this is from their strategic plan. So in 2003, 2006, they weren't using it at all. I think it was about 1 or 2 instances in 2007 to 2009. Then we see it moving up, 2010 to 2012, they start talking about translation. This is when CIHR is mandating translation, right? 2000. Yeah, 2000, sorry, yeah. So for us, we're 10 years behind or more. And then we see it go right up here. So we're starting to get more talk in the strategic plan. What's really interesting about this is we're talking about the use of the term in a plan for a funder who doesn't fund it. It's very interesting. Frustrating. What they do fund is they fund centres of research excellence where they talk about translation. And when I say talk about, the extent of translation is, yep, we're going to talk to policymakers, or we're going to write a policy brief and we're going to publish papers. But they do fund TRIP fellowships, so Translating Research into Practice fellowships. They give out about, I think it's about 3 or 4 a year, and they've been doing this since 2010. And these fellows get money to do translation and to train in translation. And many of them have come over here and done training with many different organisations, including with Melanie's training. What's really interesting about it is I've also worked with many of these TRIP fellowships or TRIP fellows who've said, my supervisor doesn't know what I'm doing. They don't know how to support me in doing translation because they don't know what it is. They've got the fellowship. The fellowship means that they're really just working in conjunction with an industry partner, or I say industry in the broadest sense, so a medical partner or a clinic or some other way of getting research into practice. But again, there's no KT planning that goes on with this. So in 2011, the NHMRC said, okay, well, let's hold an inaugural research translation symposium. And I think this was really a way to say, let's hear from our TRIP fellows about what they're doing. And they do this every year. They have been doing it every year, but really it's just a research symposium. You go along. No one talks about methods for translation. People just talk about the research they did and what they've done. So it's still, we're still petering around the edges, if you like. And in 2012, we introduced the Research Translation Faculty, the criteria of which is you have to hold an NHMRC grant and you can be part of the translation faculty. So we're still talking about people who are part of this faculty and talking about translation, but still not funding it, still not really focusing on how we can do it. Hopefully this will change. And in 2014, we saw the first real targeted change in this area, and that lines up nicely with this greater use of the terminology. And we have now advanced health research and translation centres. So this is where they want to bring together a whole group of different universities to work in partnership along with partners in the health medical sector. So this is starting to work. what they made people do was to apply to become a centre. So we have these centres around Australia. So there'll be a couple in New South Wales, maybe one in Western Australia and one in Adelaide, sort of in South Australia area, different centres, but they didn't fund them. We're talking about people who brought together a group of people and still no money. Then last year they said, okay, we're going to put out some funding that you can only get if you are part of an advanced health research and translation centre. They gave out 3 lots of $100,000. We're not taking translation seriously in Australia. It's very interesting, but things are changing. I keep telling you that, I hope so. It has to change. So we have a lot of challenges that are remaining because we don't have a clear direction. We have our funders saying one thing, but not giving us the means to do it. Plus there's no funding for people to train in it. They're not rewarding any translation activities. And well, funding is an interesting one that we're seeing moving forward, and there are changes in there. So the changes I'm talking about are from the smaller funders. We've seen our departments of health. So Department of Health in New South Wales, one of our states, and also in Queensland, now require that when you apply for funding, you put in a knowledge translation plan, and they're using the term knowledge translation. It's very exciting. We also have some small funders, private hospital funding, a group called Healthway in Western Australia who brought Melanie over a number of years ago. And we have those funders who are saying, well, we want to get more for our money because, you know, we want to do public good. So they're starting to say, how can we do translation, and to ask for more translation and to fund translation, but it's very small pots of money, as you'd imagine. And also the people who are applying for it are always the same people because they're the people who know how to do it. So we're not seeing a diverse range of people do it. The MRFF, please excuse the acronym, is the Medical Research Future Fund. The Medical Research Future Fund, from my memory, is a fund of around $20 billion over the next however many years that makes Australia one of the biggest funders of health and medical research. It's very exciting. We'll see if it lasts when they change government. But that process provided me, particularly, an opportunity to stand in front of a Senate committee and say, if you're going to be the biggest funder of health and medical research in the world, you need to do more with that research. You need to have translation as part of what you're funding. There's still a bit of debate around how they're going to fund it, what they're going to fund. Meanwhile, we've had, you know, changing government and a whole bunch of things. Well, not changing government, we've had another election and now nobody really has any power. So that's interesting to watch. But it's a lot of money, and if it gets used the right way, we can see things really take off and be quite beneficial in the translation space. So I'm crossing my fingers, but we'll see what happens. Their one stipulation around this Medical Research Future Fund is that the funding must be spent differently than the way our current NHMRC spends the money. So you've got to remember, the NHMRC are talking about translation. I'm hopeful that the MRFF doesn't look at it and say, they're doing that, so we're not touching it. And I've talked to them very strongly about that, so we'll see what happens. We also have the research impact agenda on our doorstep happening right now. Now, I know that you guys here in Canada don't really have a lot to go with research impact right now, but has everyone heard about what's happening in the UK with research impact? Yeah, a few people, maybe not. I'll talk through a little bit. But research impact has become this pretty big global agenda that's been driven a little bit by the UK. And I'm pretty sure we'll hit your shores as well at some point. And that's what I want to delve into a little bit more now. So what we've seen in Australia is back in 2012, we had this Excellence in Innovation for Australia trial. So 12 universities provided case studies of research to show the impact they'd had. And the government looked at this and sort of had to think about it, and they were going to do something with it, and then said, no, it's all too hard. So it kind of got left to the side. But we did come up with a definition for research impact. So Australian Research Council is our other funder. So that's essentially SSHRC, is it? The Social Sciences funder. So you guys have CIHR and SSHRC as the major ones. So the Australian Research Council is our other major one. And this is our definition of research impact, and it's still our definition today. What's really interesting is that it's a definition that talks only about contributions beyond academia. And when you talk to basic scientists, they get really scared about this because there are impacts you can have from developing new technologies, faster ways of creating different things in the lab, doing better testing. And we're sort of not inclusive of that, which can be a problem. But the definition is pretty good, and we're talking about all the other things that we do. We're talking about all the other things that we do. So then it took till 2015, and there was a government, government had a review. They said, okay, we're going to do a review of all university funding. And so they got this man, I can't remember his first name, somebody Watt, who obviously was very important. So it's now called the Watt Review, who did this review of funding and came up with 21 recommendations. At the time, we had a government that was very progressive. We have an innovation agenda in Australia. We want to be innovative. We want to have better business opportunities, and we want to have spin-out companies from research and all these different things. And they accepted all 21 recommendations. One of those recommendations was that we develop an impact and engagement framework that's going to help us decide how to fund universities in the future. This is sort of heading down the UK path. And it was really interesting, and universities kind of went, oh God, okay, what's going to happen now? We also at the same time had a national innovation and science agenda announced, which has sort of suggested they want more commercialisation in our universities, a lot more commercialisation, a lot more industry partnership, working with people outside of the university, which is good news. So in 2016, our research council said, let's do a public consultation, let's talk to researchers, let's talk to universities, and let's develop the framework. What do we want to do with, create this framework? And they want to, it's important to note that the framework is impact and engagement, not just impact. So they separated the two things. And they said, well, maybe working with an industry partner is a proxy for engagement. It's a really bad proxy. They were saying how much money you get from an industry partner suggests that you have engagement. But we know that having money from a partner and actually doing something that's useful to a partner doesn't always happen, because people sometimes get the money and run off and do other things. So right now, we have the impact and engagement assessment pilot happening in Australia as we speak, and people are panicked. And the universities get to choose whether or not they're involved at the moment. And what it involves is writing case studies. So they're being asked for different fields of research to write a case study of the impact they've had over the last number of however many years, 6 or so years. And they also have to, so they have to write narratives, both for an impact narrative, but also for an engagement narrative. So they have some indicators that are numbers for engagement, like dollars from different industry partners, but they also need to add some narrative around how have you engaged them and all those types of other things. And interestingly, in the guidelines for this framework, and what they're asking are the words translation, or the word translation is in there. So they have started to tie translation to engagement and impact, which is very, very powerful. So I want to talk a little bit now about around the globe, the research impact. And as I said, I'm not an expert around the globe, but I just want to talk about the things that I know, just to kind of highlight what is happening. Obviously, the UK are what I believe leading in the impact space, but really interesting. In 2008, Australia developed this research quality framework. It was a different government and it was a different time, and they said, we want to talk about the research quality that's coming out of the university, not just excellence from publications, but sort of starting to talk about case studies. They started to talk about having these narratives and peer reviewing them to assess the university's performance. We had a change of government. The RQF got thrown out. This is familiar to everyone, right? Change of government, everything gets changed. So the RQF got thrown out and the framework was never used in Australia. But the UK said, hey, let's take it up, let's have a look. So in 2009 to 2012, in England, HEFCE developed their Research Excellence Framework, commonly known as the REF. And in 2014, they ran their first full REF exercise. And it's got a lot of interest globally. So what it was every university had to submit case studies of research impact from their universities. And based on the impact that the university had, the government would give them money. So in the future, universities who have a lot of impact from their research will get more money than universities that don't have a lot of impact. There'll be gamification of the system, there always is. But interestingly, the 4-star case study, which is the highest level, so you have 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star case study, is worth around £44,000 on average to the university. So you can imagine universities writing 20, 30 case studies worth this amount of money is pretty good. So we're going to see research change as well. It's going to become much more applied, I guess, from these kind of measures. So that's the UK kind of ref story. New Zealand, I didn't realise this until I did some work there last year, are even ahead of Australia, which is interesting, and they're really little. But they have their funder, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, who have said, we want you, in your submission to us when you're applying for funding, to write an impact pathway and an impact plan in the submission. This impact pathway is essentially knowledge translation. So we'll get to that in a minute. They also have, when they assess the grants, the grant goes for a scientific panel, 50%, and then it goes to an impact panel made up of non-academics, industry people, to look at whether or not it's impactful, and then it's decided on funding. So it's a really interesting system. They also have their performance-based research fund, which is the fund that rewards universities based on impact. So it's sort of a little bit like the REF, only they don't do case studies. They just have to write a report. And 30% is based on their research contributions, and they can have lots of different activities they do, not just peer-reviewed publications. So when I'm talking about impact, you know, a lot of people go to the place of peer-reviewed journal papers as impact, in Australia particularly. But I'm not talking about any peer-reviewed journal publications. I'm talking about all the other impact we can have on society and benefits and all those types of things. And that is exactly what New Zealand is putting 30% of their emphasis on when they look at how a researcher is performing and how that makes a university perform overall. And then we have the USA, and I only know a very tiny little piece of this because I managed to be able to interview Susan Reno, University of Missouri, I think, last year, and she talked about the National Alliance for Broader Impact. So there's probably someone in the room who knows a little bit more about what's happening in the US. But they are creating community practice to foster impact. They work particularly to create partnerships for researchers within the universities to work with industry, which is at least starting to do that linking. One of the interesting things was they match people up and then they kind of leave them to their own devices, but they do have to go back and assess their performance. So there's a few interesting elements starting off there. But as far as I'm aware, for KT, it's not a term that's used there. It's more science communication and dissemination. And that's all I know about the US. And then because of this agenda in Australia with research impact and my interest particularly with knowledge translation and how knowledge translation and research impact come together, I wanted to help people to understand that they're not two separate things. What I was seeing in Australia in particular was that when I talked to people about knowledge translation, they'd say, yeah, I'm not really interested in translation. And I say, okay, well, you know, if you're thinking about the impact agenda, just get in touch. And I say, oh, impact, you do stuff on impact. Okay, so the language and the terminology. So then we start to have this conversation about research impact, and I realized that I need to educate a lot of people. So I wanted to bring together people to explain what impact was and translation was and how it all fits together. So last year, I ran the first Research Impact Summit. The Research Impact Summit was a free online event for as many people who wanted to sign up. It ran for 3 days, and it'll run for 3 days every year now because it was such a success. It's completely free, completely online. We had an international audience, and the goal of the whole summit is to help people understand how to do stuff, like how to do the translation, how to understand implementation, what impact really is, what funders are thinking. So I interviewed a whole bunch of people from all over the world with an agenda that covered off on impact, on translation, or all of those things. I wanted to build a movement around research impact globally, not just in Australia, but globally. I want us all to be on the same page around how translation fits with impact, because we're all working for the same means. So it helped to do that and got to share experiences and expertise with as many people as possible. That was the other goal, as many people as possible. Everyone having an opportunity, because the number one things that happen are people say to me, I don't have time, I don't have money. So what can we do to overcome that? We can give you something for free and we can put it online so you can sit at your desk and watch it. We can watch it on video whenever you like. So I wanted to do something that was affordable. We had 25 speakers from all around, and it was fantastic to be able to speak to so many, some of which were funders. We had Melanie was one of our speakers, David Phipps, who's not here, but he was one of our speakers, and speakers from all around the world on different topics, whether it be altmetric. So I had someone from altmetric who was speaking, and I interviewed these people to ask them questions about the real how-to, like not the stuff we present at a conference when we say, I did this study and the stats said this, but really, when you were working with that partner, what did you do when stuff went wrong? What advice would you give to someone going out there and doing it tomorrow? What's the real crap that happens that no one ever wants to talk about? Because we don't write papers about that stuff. We don't write papers about the stuff that doesn't work and the headaches that we had and how we knew in hindsight that this wouldn't work and that would work. And that's what I wanted people to talk about. As one of my speakers from the UK said when I asked him if he'd be involved, he said, oh, you want us to have the conversations we normally have in the pub at the conference? I said, yeah, because I want it to be fun. So everyone had to be fun, but I also wanted people to be able to take things from it and learn, not just read another paper. We can all go and read a paper, a journal article. But sometimes when we read the journal article, there's that little voice in your head that says, that all sounds really good on paper, but I wonder what really happened. I wonder if that partner was a real pain in the bum to work with, or were they good? So being able to ask some of those questions and really delve into that. We had 1,200 registered attendees from 12 countries. I was very excited because when I started this, I remember saying, oh, well, you know, maybe if 400 people sign up, I'll be really happy. 1,200. And 33% of the audience was Australian, which was very good. Mostly the audience was UK, and then Australian, then Canadian, because obviously the term research impact in Canada is not as common. So that runs every year, keep your eye out. So the reason, you know, has anyone been to ISRIA, the International School on Research Impact Assessment? No? Okay, so I went to this international school, ISRIA, in Qatar a couple of years ago. Now, you know, International School on Research Impact Assessment. I am high hopes that I'm going to go to this school, I'm going to walk in and someone's going to say, this is how you know if you had an impact. Well, there's expectations and there's reality. That wasn't my reality. What I did find, and what was very fascinating to me, is that research impact assessment was KT repackaged. And this is when I kind of went, okay, another penny drop moment. I have a few of these penny drop moments. Another penny drop moment was KT leads to impact. It's the same thing. So in thinking about research impact and the research impact assessment, they talk about, you know, making sure your research is relevant. So that means asking people what they want and whether or not it's going to be of value to them or useful to them or usable. Having collaborations with your research partnerships, knowing who your partners should be. Having the right outputs and deliverables. Believe it or not, if it's not in the right format, people can't use it. Implementing things, so thinking about, can you implement? Is there a way it can be put into practice or taken up by someone into practice? And all of those things create impact. So this is what is known as the impact pathway, and it's the same pathway we see in funders of New Zealand. It's the same pathway we see at the Research Impact Assessment School, even though they do also talk about bibliometrics and other things. But we're talking about social benefit and impact, broader impact than just peer review publications. There we go. Then I came across a paper written from Fast Track Impact, or a blog actually, and it was based on the REF in the UK, and it was based on what are the 10 lessons of grant proposals that lead to significant and far-reaching impacts. And if you look at these elements, and I love this, it's perfect, and you think about what these things are. So firstly, vision. What is the vision of your research? What is it you hope to achieve? Essentially, what is your goal? Specificity of audiences. Who are your audiences? What are your methods? What are the dates you hope to deliver on? Who are you going to involve, how and when, and the phases? Tailoring your impact for each audience. So what is it you're delivering? It might be what's your message for each audience, or what are you delivering as a product or a service or information or knowledge for each audience. Being flexible, being able to tailor this to different stakeholders. So different stakeholders want different things. They need different messages. And adapting it as required. Who's playing what role? So being able to assign responsibility. Demonstrating demand, or as I like to say, doing your market research. Is what you're doing useful and valuable to the people who need it, who want it, and that you are trying to ultimately serve? Having collaborative partnerships, the sensitivities, so knowing whether or not how to work with your stakeholders, what the behaviour and context around that is, and the sensitivities. And underpinning all of the successful grant and 4-star case studies that they looked at was passion and commitment for the research that you were doing or had done. Now, when you look at this list, and when I looked at this list, I saw KT. It's all I saw was all of these elements are KT. And when you think about planning for KT, or you think about KT generally, all of these elements are in there in some way or form. It might be laid out a little differently, but they're all there. So what we're seeing is that an impact pathway is actually KT, and that KT is part of that pathway to impact. So Canada and opportunities. Well, I have 2 quotes that I want to share with you because I love them. So firstly, David Phipps, who most of you would know. And I've always loved that he says, impact is measured at the level of the user. And I remember him visiting Australia when I brought him out there many years ago, and him talking to some people and saying that, and them kind of just going, oh, penny drop for them, right? So when researchers are talking about research impact, like they are right now, I say to them, you do realise that research impact isn't happening at you. Research impact requires you to work with someone who actually uses it so it has an impact, or who needs it, or who can take it and do something more with it. So it's that user level. So thinking about who it is you're going to work with. The other quote from Melanie is that impact shows that people knew what to do with what you shared. And this is where the market research really becomes important. People know what it is to do with it. So you've done the research, you know what they want, the message is relevant to them, its context fits into their context. So for KT or for impact or for whatever in Canada, I think there's a real opportunity to continue the awareness and the education so that if you do have an impact agenda that comes up here, you know that you're poised for it. It's just that it's probably a different terminology. Maybe there are things to tweak, but I think if you can keep continuing the education and awareness around how translation is vital. One of the biggest mistakes we've made in Australia is we're talking about measuring impact. We haven't talked about or started to think about how we create impact. KT is how you create impact because you work with the right people, you know that what you're doing is relevant, and you started to think about what it is that you want to achieve, the goals, what are you delivering, whatever it might be. So that's our mistake. But you guys have started the first bit, so you're ready to get to the next bit. Having engagement, relationships and partnerships are vital. I'm sure that's happening with all the funding that's happening in KT here. Integrated KT is the pathway to impact. That's how I teach it. That's how I want people to start to think about it, particularly in Australia where we have an impact agenda and people don't want to talk about KT, they just want to talk about impact. All we have to do is learn how to sell it to them and package it to them in the right way. And when I say them, I'm talking about researchers who don't get it, and I'm talking about funders who don't believe in it or understand it or want to fund it. So that's me. I don't know how long I took, but I'm ready to answer any questions you might have, aside from questions about the US context, because I don't know anything else. Are there any questions either in the room or online? Yeah, please. They won't be able to hear you online, so maybe if you can push it, please. Yeah.
Okay, so one of my questions is about, you were talking about the engagement and impact assessment, I think, right? So I work at the Ontario Brain Institute in Knowledge Translation and Evaluation, and one of the issues we're having is being able to measure patient engagement in research, and there's not a lot, well, as you said already, there's not a lot in the realm of research impact at all, but there's definitely nothing in the realm of patient engagement in research and how to measure the impact of that. So I was wondering if you have any experience or resources regarding patient engagement.
I don't know of any resources off the top of my head. I'm just trying to think about, you know, one of the things that's really key to me, and it might not be very helpful to you, but people all the time say, I need to know what my research impact was. I need to, you know, I need to measure my impact. I said, what do you want it to be? So what I guess I would go to is thinking about what are the measures that are relevant to you? What are the measures that will be of value to you? So if you're thinking about patient engagement, what does that look like? What do you want it to look like? So does that mean you want them to have a patient forum or patients on their steering committees or groups? You need to come up with some measures of what that would look like for you. How many patients need to be involved for it to be valuable? What types of patients, different, because we know with consumer groups, when we get consumer groups involved, that often we have the professional consumers who are the people who come to all the time. So it's the same consumers all the time. It's not necessarily really the voice of the people that aren't getting a voice. So I would say you need to think about, is a measure of that numbers? Is a measure of that opportunities for engagement, like who's turning up, how often are they engaging, what format are they engaging in, and have they done any background work to work out whether or not that form of engagement is relevant to that particular patient group. Does that help? Yeah.
So Tamika, we have a question online from Ria Gangley. There's a lot of confusion around tech transfer, research impact, knowledge translation. What would you propose institutions can do to clarify the differences, if any? How can these areas work together?
Yeah, it's a tough question. It's one I grapple with a lot because I meet with people and they say, oh, you need to talk to the commercialization office. Oh, you need to talk to the comms people. Oh, you need to talk to these, you know, and it's like you don't realize that. The way that I like to position this is that KT is this system and tech transfer is part of KT. It's one avenue of how we do translation is to have technology transfer or commercialize something. Research impact is the ultimate outcome from having very good KT throughout the research process. So having people involved, having a plan, knowing what our goals are, having the right deliverables, that's how we get to impact. But it's really, it's a really big educational piece. We have to start educating people, and that's why I'm trying to do this with this global movement, with Research Impact Summit, and to try and share that we are all working in the same space. It's terminology gets us hooked up. We need to think about how we stop tripping over one another. But unfortunately, one of the other things that I see happen is that we're all competing, and it can't be a competition. What we have to do is say, you have knowledge in this area, I have knowledge in this area. Let's all agree that, you know, your expertise and my expertise together is much more powerful than one of us on our own. But that's really hard because as researchers, traditionally, we've been very competitive because we have to compete for grants, we have to compete for promotion, we have to compete. So we're not used to working in this way.
Okay. From Don Buchanan, is there much use of evidence-informed practice in public education K-12 in Australia?
I don't know the answer to that, but I would imagine that there would be, but I don't know the specific answer to that, no.
Okay. Another question from Phoebe Ann Wolf from one of the concerns researchers have is whether or how KT will be valued in their tenure and promotion process. I know some Canadian universities now take non-traditional forms of output into account, e.g. things besides academic publications and conferences in the promotion process. Do you know if this is the case in Australia or any other countries you know of?
I know that in Australia, it's definitely, it doesn't count. Anything you do in KT will not count for promotion or tenure. The universities just really don't value it. But that's changing because the universities are now going to be funded based on impact. So those activities that are translation activities that lead to impact are suddenly going to be very valued. And we're starting to see that in Australia with people coming to me and saying, we need your help, we need the researchers to understand this because they've got to have an impact. So it is changing for us in Australia, but it's the reward mechanisms don't always match up between what a funder wants and what a university wants. And if our NHMRC or your CIHR says, well, we only reward peer-reviewed publication, but your university is saying, well, we want peer-reviewed publication because we've got to have excellence globally. We want to be in the top 20 universities in the world, but we also want you to have all this impact so that our university gets more money. There's just no alignment of the system. Yeah. In New Zealand, they are doing more in that space, as far as I can tell, because they're saying 30% of what we're going to rank a researcher and a university overall as a group on 30% of their outputs being other things. So yeah, that's an interesting.
So I can add to that just so in the United States, it's referred to as community engaged scholarship. And for many universities, including I think Harvard and some other sort of A-line top universities, it is considered. And at the University of Toronto, it's considered as creative professional activity alongside teaching and research. And so, and then David, if he were here, David Phipps would say that as part of Community Engaged Scholarship Canada, there's a handful, more than a handful, probably 10 or 12 different universities who are part of the research impact family, where they have a real interest in knowledge translation and how it pertains to how it is considered scholarship. And so we've advanced quite a bit in Canada, in the United States they have as well. I think where a lot of KT is silent is in Europe, surprisingly. And as I was hearing you speak, and as we've spoken about before, for me, I find that a bit unusual. We had our first Spanish participant to the Knowledge Translation Professional Certificate. Apart from the UK and then your part of the world, we've had no one really come from Europe. And so while Europe has communities involved in implementation science that we see through our global implementation community, sort of that's a subspecialty along with commercialization. I'd say implementation science is a subspecialty of a broader view of knowledge translation. And yet there's not a lot of traction for knowledge translation in Europe. In the United States, I've only just started getting requests for scientist KT training where they're starting to think about knowledge translation. So interesting to see the diversity or the variance of localized thinking and action and sort of hard changes in sort of institutions that support research.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mention Europe. I'll come to in a minute. There's an organisation, AESIS. I don't know what it stands for, but they are doing impact. They are kind of the Netherlands and that kind of area, and more globally Europe. So I think they are starting to do that. I just haven't delved into it too much just yet. But also there's a huge funding source in. It's an EU funding source that's looking a lot now. I can't remember what it is, but there's a big one that's looking more at the impact stuff and sort of that translation space, which is quite interesting to watch. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you did with the Aboriginal health research and what your KT work there looked like?
Yeah, that was a long time ago. Well, that was right at the beginning of my KT journey, and I wish I'd done more. Oh, sure. So it was explain a little bit more about the work that I did with the Aboriginal health research when I was part of the CRE and specifically with KT. So my position was managing a centre, and it was my first foray into translation. So I just came and trained in translation, and most of what I did was really just brokering relationships. So what I did was I worked out who I knew already, and I had a few people who worked in key spots in Aboriginal health at our Department of Health, and managed to get some meetings with key policymakers and start to introduce those to the researchers in the research centre, and managed to get them to come to different meetings and things, which was really valuable, of course. I also helped to really say how we're going to write reports that are much more relevant to
different audiences as opposed to the single audience, and just really starting the thinking process. But Aboriginal research, and I think it's the same here, is really a community of practice in itself, because you have to work with community. That's what got me interested in this, is the fact that in Aboriginal research, you can't just take from the community. You can't just go in there, do a survey and take it from them. It has to be driven by them, and it has to be given back to them. And for me, that was a real eye-opener, because I was thinking, why don't we do this with all research? Why are we just taking from people? Why are people not driving more of what we do so that it does fit into the context? So I'm guessing that you're working in an Aboriginal research space? Yeah. So it was my first foray. For me, the most tricky thing about it, and I don't know if it's the same here, was I was non-Aboriginal working in an Aboriginal centre. The researchers were all Aboriginal researchers. So no matter what I really suggested, my voice was bottom of the pile. So it was really tricky, but it was definitely a rewarding challenge. So it's worth, trying to keep doing it. Anything else? Anything else online? Any other comments, like about what if the research impact agenda comes here? Oh, you have a question, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, me?
No, we've got one here.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm not sure if my microphone's actually doing anything. It was more of a comment relating to the discussion around how Katie's taking off in the UK, and I was there at the point of the Clarks, the Collaborations for Leadership and Applied Health Research and Care, coming to life. And it seems as though the UK went about in the opposite way to what Australia's going about it, in where we started the doing and then kind of worried about the impact later, the reverse of what you're doing. So the Clarks had to be set in a healthcare organisation, not an academic organisation, but involve academic partners. And so it really brought to life the integrated KT model. But what was interesting, I think they started 2009, I was at the start, was even though we're doing all this great stuff, the NIHR, the National Institute of Health Research, hadn't caught up in terms of how they would then assess the impact of that. So every year we had to send off to the NIHR our annual report of how we're doing. But the Clarks, there was one in each area of the country. One of the main ways which it was assessed was, well, what papers have you got in? What impacts have you had? And our Clark actually challenged that quite substantially to say, well, yeah, we'll do that, but here's all the case studies of the real world impact we're having. And so I just found it kind of funny when it seems to be the reverse happening in Australia.
Yeah, I think, we're trying to play catch up. We're literally saying, oof, everyone's talking about impact. We better do something about it because we've been talking about it for a while. But I still joke about how in Australia we're doing ref light because our universities will only ever have to submit 22 case studies. I think, I'm not sure how many it was in the UK, but it was a lot more than 22.
Yeah, it was a certain number per university, I think.
Yeah, but it was more like 50 or 60, I think. It was high. If you can just switch up your mic off. You're up.
Hi, I wanted to ask you to speak more to your comment on how there's more knowledge to translate than just research, and maybe some examples. And then my second question is, in Canada, I think it's easier to get grants for a study on something that's new, some new finding that you want to establish, and something that you've piloted and you know it works and you want to broaden that impact and evaluate that. So I wonder if in the KT process, you can think of a way to call it research while you're actually doing the KT of the actual previous research, and then it might maybe be more viable.
Yeah, so a couple of answers there. So more than just research knowledge. So when I talk about that, what I mean is the knowledge that you have from research, it's not, it might be, but it's not always just one research study. So it's multiple knowledges, it's knowledge in a different context. It might be other, reviews of other work and how yours fits into that work. But also, really importantly, knowledge of lived experience, knowledge of working in a certain context. So when I talk about that knowledge translation is better than research translation, it's because research is not the only factor to consider around knowledge. Knowledge must be knowledge from research, knowledge from experience in the context of where you're trying to deliver this research. It could be knowledge of lived experience or knowledge of being a practitioner, a clinician, the knowledge of different worlds, if you like. It's not just, I'm an expert, I've just done this research, here you go, you use it because I know it's right and I'm an expert. It's like saying to someone in an emergency room, an emergency doctor, okay, well, we've developed up a new 50-question questionnaire. So everyone that comes in, can you just take them through this questionnaire? Because it's really impractical in their context. And that's just an out there sort of example. But it's about understanding their world so you can deliver something that might go down a bit better, if you like, for want of a nicer term, but it might also be seen to be helpful. It helps in building that relationship because everyone has value in the conversation, not just the research that you're doing. As far as the Canada question, I'm not fully aware of the Canadian funding, but what I would say is there would possibly be opportunities to get funding to do research on translation. There is, isn't there? Mm-hmm. So yeah, if you're interested in doing that, the problem I see is that a lot of researchers are not interested in doing research on translation. So if you're interested in doing that, I would definitely say, let's use the translation part as its own project. And then it really becomes implementation, right? Yeah. Yeah, next question.
Yeah, thanks. A couple of points.
Can you just lean right over the microphone? Yeah.
Yep.
Good.
The Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council most certainly does fund components of knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization. So that is, I mean, it's in the social sciences, not in the medical sciences, but certainly an avenue to go there. And although we don't seeing a whole lot of research impact, a lot of work happening both in the US and in Canada is around the notion of collective impact. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of parallels with that work, and you see a lot of that happening within the communities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really parallels with social impact of not-for-profits and things as well. I mean, it's not just that we're not having impact, it's that we just don't recognize that we could be better at creating it, better at capturing it, and just better at working with people so that we have opportunities to do more, I think is the key one. There were no more online questions? Okay, perfect. Oh, one more. Yep, go for it.
All right. Thanks very much for the presentation, and I was really fascinated by that impact agenda. I wonder if you could just, if you have a couple minutes, elaborate on pitfalls or challenges to that impact agenda that are almost possibly baked in. I could imagine that some researchers would provide a lot of pushback because they may not see their research as being where it is not as easy to show that impact so easily, and then possibly be disadvantaged in the in the grant
absolutely
process. Or on the other hand, we see that from all kinds of other agendas, whether it's standardized testing or other things, where as soon as we start measuring things and attaching money to that, people are chasing those scores, and things that can be measured are much more easily. Some things are more easily measured than others.
Absolutely. So there is a big fear from a lot of researchers. If you're a basic scientist or a laboratory scientist, of course, there's a fear because it's not applied enough. And there are people saying, oh, so they're only going to ever fund applied research, which could be a problem. Then we don't have blue sky research. We're not going to discover anything. So of course there's that. There's the other one that always comes up with, I'm already doing a lot of stuff in research. I don't have time for this. That's the same thing that comes up with KT, and I think it comes back to being rewarded both by your university and by the funder. So it's definitely tricky for everyone to get on board. There's a lot of considerations, but I do think that we can start right at the beginning and say, how can we train PhD students to be aware and accept that this is the go? We need to change culture. We need to change culture right at the beginning, and we need to give young researchers opportunities to start saying, this is how you create a partnership, this is how you manage a relationship. Because I don't know about you, but there's a lot of researchers who are not good at talking to people. They don't all have to be good at talking to people. They need to work with someone who's good at, I think teams are the way of the future for sure. So did you want to ask one? Do we have time for one last question? That's on, isn't it? Yep.
Yeah, I had a question, the similar thought. I'm a scientist and trained in fundamental science, and I'm always a bit conflicted because my current job involves a lot of KT, and whenever I attend KT events, I get that conflicted feeling that you forced so nicely. And I was wondering if you already see, or somebody has looked at it, Melanie maybe, if you see a difference between countries that are very advanced in their KT and their impact statements, whatever, and the ones that are not so, where it's not so popular or not, it's not so present in the, you know, in the funding reports, etc., that you have to do, whether you already have a sense of like what type of research gets funded or not, because I know a lot of fundamental scientists feel that pressure. And when we look in history, you know, some science takes a long time. When, you know, Higgs even said, if I was employed now, then, you know, I would not be employed because it took me 10 years to write.
But I think one of the things that I've seen talking to philanthropy funders, you call them that here, philanthropists, is that the thing that really annoys them is the ability of someone who may be a discovery scientist, a laboratory scientist, who can't zoom out to see a bigger picture. So it's great to be looking at this thing now, but you need to be able to tell me why you're looking at this thing now. Why are you doing this for the future? What's the important thing down the line? So your impact will not be today, but maybe your impact will be an academic impact in that you find something that helps the next person do something amazing much quicker, which is why I think looking beyond academia is not always the best way with impact. I think we need to look at both. Someone else has got, you are blinking because someone else has pushed it.
Oh, it was me. You can finish your question.
So, and yeah, I totally agree with that. But that's the message to like the scientists. What I think the scientist's concern is, do the funders understand that? You know, so how, and also as a kid, you know, the community that advocates a lot for KT in their messages, like I'm new to this, this field, but like, is there a way that you can, that the KT professionals bring a balanced message of, you know, there's also certain funding that we do need for that very, you know, fundamental scientific research that is maybe not that easily translated to the consumer or user or.
Yeah, it's about different audiences.
I'm going to sidle up next to you so I can talk into your mic.
It's very romantic.
I don't think research funders in Canada are basing their funding decisions on the KT plans. So let me just say that first and foremost. And many of them will have varied experience and background in knowledge translation to discern what's a good KT plan and what isn't. That said, anybody who's written a research proposal knows that whatever you say in that first paragraph or two to build a business case for the research nails it or doesn't nail it, right? And part of saying that is, here's our question, here's why it's important, here's what we're going to do about it, and here's what we envision this will lead to. So we've always written that kind of paragraph even in a pre-knowledge translation environment, because that's your business case, and that's what's going to capture the reviewer's awareness, their passion. They're either going to come along the journey with you or they're not. And that hasn't changed. It might be stronger now in the sense that we are all competing for fewer funding dollars. And so that first page, that first paragraph, that first section is really key. You know, then you have to convince people of the science. And yes, you also then have to convince people that this is going to go somewhere. As we educate people about good knowledge translation planning, more people will appreciate that a basic scientist KT plan is going to look inherently different than a health systems researcher's KT plan, and that's okay. What you need to do is have a plan that makes sense for you and be able to demonstrate your impacts in academia and perhaps in industry or clinical practice or even beyond, whereas impacts for somebody further down the science continuum will look a little bit different. So, I mean, we're trying to move the bar, change our institutions, change our our workflows and our processes whilst educating everybody and keeping everyone on the same page. So, you know, it takes a village. Yeah, that's kind of what I would.
Yeah, and I'd also just say it really is about why. Like, really, why are you doing what you're doing? And if you think back to those points I put up there, it's that what's the vision of what you're doing? So being able to say, this is what I'm doing right now. This is the little thing I'm doing right now, but this is the why, and that's that zooming out bigger piece. Because why is it important? Like, you need to tell the funder, why should they give you money? Why should the person reading your grant even read it? Why should they turn the page to the next page? You need to keep them on going. You need to keep telling them why this is important. What does it mean to them? What does it mean to Canada? What does it mean to whoever it might, depending on the funder that you're applying to? So thinking always about why you're doing what you're doing and bringing in that passion about why you're doing it. One of the other things that's really interesting so I just visited Kennedy Space Center not long ago, and I don't know if anyone's into kind of, you know, rocket launches and things, because that's exciting. But I was going through the Space Center and all the other things that have come out of sending a man to the moon, all the other things that have come out of the science and the research they've done, that they've created, that they didn't know they would create when they started this program. So you need to be able to build this bigger vision of having, you know, taking a chance to develop something and what you want to create, and be able to get really passionate about that and try and get the reader really passionate about that too. Yeah.
I think I was just kind of
the
going.
last question, just because we'll tie up.
I was just going to echo from our experience that we often have a hard time of like showing the dollars and or in clinical changes or patients impacted from, you know, something that was coming out of a knowledge translation pathway. But then what we've learned is that all you kind of have to do is explain to whoever you're trying to persuade that you achieve that goal, that it's a process. Like, you're not going to be able to show that impact immediately, but you can show upstream demonstrations of that. And by showing those upstream demonstrations, you can say, we're not there yet. In fact, maybe you should give us more money so we can get there. But because we can kind of demonstrate that upstream impact has happened, sometimes it is a publication, sometimes you need the publication to do the clinical practice guidelines, or sometimes, you know, that upstream stuff is still important and it needs to happen, as you said, before you can even have the impact. And that might be helpful, and it tends to work for us because it's a part of a larger story. But yeah, that was it.
But it also happens on two levels. So there's the individual scientists describing what their science is, their knowledge translation activities, and how they'll know that they met their KT goals, right? Which are really proximal. And then, as many scientists do that within Ontario Brain Institute or within an organization like a university or within a country, it's the aggregate indices that then roll up into organizational impact or countrywide impact. And what you often see in Australia, for instance, is the going backwards from let's capture our country impact without really thinking about, well, country impact is only going to emerge if you use indices that cut across at a country level or an organizational level, which don't really capture everything you want to capture. Or if you train individual researchers working in those organizations to think about their individual knowledge translation impact, and then you aggregate that. And so, you know, it's some interesting challenges to see how it's playing out in the UK and in Australia and New Zealand and here in very different ways, and within organizations as well. So,
Yeah, great.
Anyway, on behalf of the Knowledge Translation and Exchange Community Practice and our host today, the Hospital for Sick Children, thank you very much, Tamika.
You're welcome.
Thanks for coming. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to those of us who joined on cyberspace through the webinar for your questions. We do have a sheet that people are signing in. Rosanna has it. If you've not ticked your name off, it's really good for us to just know who turned up so we can get a count. Have a lovely evening, and if you're interested in the social media workshop, it's on Thursday at 9 o'clock. Email me and I'll hook you in. Okay, thank you.